Hi, Professor Dyer here, talking about research in human development and family science. So, if true experiments, randomized controlled trials, are as good as we've said they are, almost magical in their ability to identify truly causal relationships, then what is a quasi-experiment, and why would a scientist ever use one? There are some really good reasons to use quasi-experimental designs. There are things that can, at least theoretically, be evaluated with randomized controlled trials, but randomized controlled trials are incredibly difficult to implement and expensive. One of the reasons they're difficult to implement is that they require a control group. And if you recall, they require a control group into which subjects are randomly assigned. These can be very difficult to actually assemble. Imagine signing up to participate in a scientific study in your local area, and you fill out a whole bunch of paperwork at pretests in order to be in the experiment, and then the experimenter flips a coin and says, okay, you have now been assigned to the control group and you will not receive the intervention. Sometimes when people get that message, they go home and they don't show up again for the follow-up. They're disappointed that they're not getting kind of the full experience and getting maybe what they perceived as a free intervention, but it's very hard to measure them for post-test. Another issue is that random assignment is not always ethical. Sometimes there are circumstances that make it unethical to assemble a control group who will not receive an intervention. A couple other circumstances that lend themselves to quasi-experimental designs. One is when there's a change in legislation or policy. Typically, when a law changes, it changes for everybody, and there's no possibility of constructing a control group, sometimes at all, much less randomly assigning people into it. Similarly, there are historic events. You might be interested in studying the impact, for instance, of the COVID-19 pandemic on something like family life or education in the United States or anywhere, but good luck finding a control group. There's nobody out there who was not affected by that major historical event. So you're not going to be able to get a control group, much less are you going to be able to randomly assign people to either experience the COVID pandemic or not. So let's talk about ways that scientists can work with what they have when a randomized controlled trial is not possible. A quasi-experiment is designed, just like an RCT, to study the effect of an intervention, but it does not, the scientists do not have experimental control. That means that random assignment to groups is not possible. Because there's no random assignment to groups, quasi-experiments cannot have as much internal validity as an RCT. They just can't. They cannot determine cause as definitively as an RCT can, because remember these determinants of causality: correlation, temporal order, and ruling out alternative explanations. A quasi-experiment can't do all three as well. They can make some efforts in that direction, though. A quasi-experiment can still establish correlation if they can construct a control group or a comparison group. I just gave you some examples where control groups are not possible, but if possible, the scientists should be constructing a control group, and the intention of the control group is for it to be as similar as possible to the intervention group. Another thing a scientist can do in order to establish temporal order is to include a pretest to measure folks before the legislation goes into effect. You see? So you could do that with legislation. It's hard to do with historical events because you might not know they're coming when they come. So it's not always possible to have a pretest, but it's better if you can. Finally, to rule out alternative explanations, it's best to use random assignment. That's the magic wand there. But if random assignment is not possible, then what can the scientists do? Well, they can kind of they can work to control some of the possible third factors. There's really two ways to do that. One is by restricting the sample. So if you think one of the third factors might be socioeconomic status, let's say, and you think this intervention might work great for poor kids but not great for middle-class kids, if you have reason to believe that, then you restrict your sample either only to poor kids or only to middle-class kids. You restrict the sample so that the third variable, the third factor, is no longer involved in this particular study. A more sophisticated way to do that is to study all of those kids, but use statistical controls to look at the two groups where you think that the two groups are shaped by a potential third factor. Let's look at an example of a high-quality quasi-experimental design that does all three of those things. It uses a control group that is very similar to the intervention group. It uses pretests to establish the temporal order, and it uses statistical controls to rule out potential third factors. I want to tell you about the Chicago Longitudinal Study. This is a study of early child care programs. They noted that small pilot programs had previously reported striking and long-term effects of early childhood intervention programs. So we had some reason in the 60s to think that early child care, early preschool programs might really have amazing benefits for especially poor children. The question that the Chicago Longitudinal Study wanted to answer was, can we scale it up? Instead of maybe 100 kids in the program, can we do this with 1,000 kids? Can a public school system like the city of Chicago provide an intervention that drastically improves the life outcomes for kids in the school system? Can we do it on a big scale? So they launched this program. The intervention included about 1,000 kids in the inner city of Chicago. It was a high-quality preschool and kindergarten, and they kept the kids in the program up through third grade, providing a few of those wraparound services, things like health services for the family and home visitation and health and nutrition services, things like that. They had high-quality teachers, well-paid teachers, small class sizes. They had home visitation programs. They did a bunch of parental involvement activities. So this is very much a comprehensive early childhood wraparound program. It includes a high-quality preschool, but it includes a lot more than that also. They had about 1,000 kids in the study, and they participated in the preschool program at age 3 and 4, and then at age 5 they went into kindergarten, and then they kept following them through first, second, maybe up through third grade. When those original kids entered kindergarten, the scientists found a comparison group of children who were in kindergarten with those intervention kids. And the reason they did this, but they had not previously participated in the preschool program. The reason they did that is they wanted the control group to be as similar as possible to the intervention kids. So they picked kids who were literally living in the same neighborhoods, going to the same schools. They had the same level of poverty, the same racial profile. So several studies have been published based on the results of the Chicago Longitudinal Study. I want to share with you two. One is the long-term effects of the early childhood intervention program on educational achievement through high school and juvenile arrest. So what happened was 15 years after these kids finished third grade, scientists went into public archival data in the city of Chicago. They went into the public school system to find out who had finished high school, what kids' grades were like when they were in high school, etc. They went through the police and court records to find out if those kids had been arrested, if they'd spent time in jail, and they went through Division of Family Services to see if they had been reported as victims of child abuse. Follow-up rate is phenomenal for a 15-year longitudinal study. 83% of the original sample they found information about them. Here's what one piece of results look like. You can see that in the preschool group, kids who got the preschool intervention were less likely to have been arrested by the time they were 18. They were less likely to have been held back in school. They were less likely to have been put in special ed. They were less likely to have been reported for as victims of child abuse, and they were more likely to have finished high school. That's pretty impressive. This study looked at what happened after many more years. How far did they go in their education? So they were looking at the kids about 35 years later. They also used archival records. They used the National Student Clearinghouse, which keeps track of students in the United States and where they are attending public schools, where they are getting degrees. Private schools contribute their data to this. The National Student Clearinghouse has data on 98% of people who go to school at any level, this includes college, in the United States. What kind of follow-up rate did they get this time? 91%. So they had an even better follow-up rate in 2018 than they'd had back in 2001. And they did identify that 4% of the subjects had died. So that means they knew where 95% of the original kids were. This is just one table that came out of that paper, but you can see how kids who had the preschool intervention as compared to kids who did not, how many of them finished their bachelor's degrees. Please note that the rate is quite low. We're looking at 12% of kids in the preschool group completed a bachelor's degree versus maybe 7%. So not many of these kids are making it that far. However, that there does appear to be a difference, a regular systematic difference, that the kids who had the preschool intervention in preschool age see some benefit from it. It looks like that effect is bigger for the female participants than the male participants. It looks like the effect is much bigger for kids whose own mother had dropped out of high school. It doesn't look like there's any effect on the children of mothers who had themselves finished high school, but it was a big effect for the kids whose mothers had not completed high school. So in conclusion, a quasi-experiment with a control group and pre-testing for things like whether the mom was a high school dropout or not, a quasi-experiment with a control group and a pretest is almost as good as a randomized controlled trial. We can absolutely establish correlation and temporal order by the Chicago Longitudinal Study. However, it's not quite as good. We cannot rule out all third factors. We've tried to rule out a bunch of them. Notice they selected a control group that was very, very similar to the intervention group, which makes it much more believable that the comparison is a good one. And they statistically controlled for multiple possible third factors. So that's sort of the best we can do with a high-quality quasi-experimental design.